Welcome to another Zrok Office Hours. I think it's been a couple months. It's been a minute. Um, a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, but I've got some stuff to show today that may not be the most exciting feature for end users, but I figured we could get into a little of the code and kind of talk about how this stuff works a little bit. If you're self-hosting and you have a multi-user instance, like I think some of this stuff might be useful to you. A lot of this stuff and what we're talking about is the new limits infrastructure. There's a On the roadmap board, there's a card called limit classes, and that was about coming up with a way that we can add more offerings and start offering some paid upgrades and that sort of thing for the Zrok IO hosted version of Zrok. Kind of had to expand on the original limits implementation. So the original implementation of limits was built as part of the 0.4 release because that was about we wanted to make it available and start making it open to the public, but we needed to make sure that we had a way to make sure that no individual account kind of ran away and just consumed way too much bandwidth and that sort of thing. So the goal was to be really generous with what we provide in terms of limits and make something that was awesome, people wanted to use, and we're really generous with what we gave for free. So obviously NetFoundry, the company behind Zrok and OpenZD, is a business, and we've got to figure out how to offer more things and hopefully build on top of the free offering and give things that enterprise users and those sorts of folks will want to pay for to some degree. I think Zrok is very much about being a great entryway into the world of OpenZD and some of that sort of stuff. So I think we're very, very committed to open source, and that's the direction. And we want to continue to build and provide all sorts of interesting capabilities on top of Zrok. And I'm still excited about 0.5. It's just been it's been a lot of stuff that we've had to deal with in the short term that's sort of pushing it out a little longer than I would want. But my goal is to get to 0.5 as soon as I can. But yeah, we've got to figure out how to pay the bills too, just like everybody else. So as far as I know, nothing's changing in terms of anything we're offering in terms of the limits that we provide today. I think what we're adding is really just about new offerings and ways to potentially monetize some of that stuff. So let's just talk about how it's built, because I think that's the interesting part. And I think in this office hours we'll get into some actual code, and I'll give you a quick tour through some of this stuff, and we'll do a little testing, and I'll talk about what it's designed to do. But the original limits implementation in 0.4 was about just being sort of a global safeguard to make sure that the multi-user instance didn't melt down if somebody and to sort of put a cap on what we could provide for free, because we're footing the bill for that free offering. So in order to support new kinds of limits and per account limits and that sort of stuff, I've been thinking about it for a while, and I came up with this concept I'm calling limits classes, or limit classes. And that's class-based limits implementations, database backed, so you can define new types of limits and then apply those to users basically. So I've got the documentation. This is a preview of the branch I'm working on of the docs. This isn't public yet. You can hit this URL if you want to look at it. If you catch it in time, by the time you see this video, it's probably already gonna be merged and on the actual doc site and released. So this is going to be in 0.4.31, and it looks like the last release was May 6th. That's 4.30. So this new release is going to have limits and a few other little minor tweaks in it. But there's some information about like how to understand what the limits agent does. The limits agent is basically a part of the Zrok controller. You can enable it or disable it. If you're running a self-hosted instance just for yourself, like you don't even need to turn any of that on. Like there's no point. It's up to you to sort of police yourself basically. You can put limits on yourself if you want to, but you certainly don't have to. And even for small multi-user installations where it's just you and people like you probably don't need to worry about any of this. But if you're running a large multi-user Zrok installation, you probably want some more flexibility in how limits work. So I talk a little bit in the doc about the kinds of limits, and basically there are two kinds of limits in the Zrok limits agent. There's what I'm calling resource count limits, which is like how many environments, how many shares. And now we're also tracking reservations, so reserved shares, and also unique names. And not in this release, but upcoming, will be being able to limit the number of front ends. So the number of people who can do a zrok access against your share. So those are all resource count limits. And then the other thing is how much data can you transfer? And those I'm calling those bandwidth limits. So how much bandwidth can you consume overall? And I think there have been a few issues or a few people that have been confused about that. There's nothing in zrok today that does any sort of rate limiting. Bandwidth in this context is about how much data transfer you're allowed to do. So the old limits agent configuration had a lot more detail than this. This is sort of the new stripped down version. The new global configuration has, the resource count stuff. So the number of environments, the number of shares, reserved shares, unique names, where -1 means unlimited. So, and this is taken from the reference version of the config file. And then the amount of bandwidth is specified in terms of a period. So in how much time, how much data you're allowed to transfer. You can specify limits in terms of received, transmitted, the total bytes. There's a Boolean in this section called enforcing. You can just set that the false, and the limits agent's completely turned off. It doesn't even ever consider limits. And then the cycle period is how frequently, like when a limit is applied to an account, the limits agent has to periodically look to see if those limits have been, if the bandwidth threshold has been fallen below whatever this period and amount is set as. And this cycle determines how frequently it evaluates that stuff. So really the cycle period is really only for bandwidth limits. Resource count limits are enforced at the time when you try and do the thing. Like if you're trying to create an environment, it evaluates the limit then. Same thing with a share and the rest of it. So the cycle time in that relax enforce process is really about bandwidth limits. And this talks about that. Talk about global resource count limits, global bandwidth limits. And then this doc now goes into this thing called limit classes. And limit classes, so far there hasn't really been a need for it. The way that we're sort of building out sort of the paid side of zrok is we're using the database itself as sort of a contract rather than putting an API around it for the short term, because we're trying to be lean and scrappy about how we're doing this, and we're not trying to gold plate any of this stuff. And just as far as I'm concerned, like the schema of the database in this context is as good of a contract as an open API spec for our purposes right now. So I mean, if the schema changes, the API is probably going to change, and when the API changes, you're changing the downstream consumer no matter what. So to save time, where I'm expecting that if you're using limit classes, you're going to go ahead and just create rows in the limit classes table. So here's the schema of it. It's sort of the same idea as the global configuration. It's got the section where you can define environment shares, unique names, reserve shares. It's got the section for the bandwidth stuff, for receive, transmit, and then it's got the limit action, which limit action is either a warning or a hard limit. And in the case of a warning, it sends an email. And maybe some folks out there that are watching this have gotten that email from the zrok.io instance. But so there's a warning section and a limit section. When your total consumed bandwidth goes above the warning, it'll send you an email saying, hey, there's a limit, and it tells you what the limit is. And then the limit section defines when it actually disables your shares. And it doesn't, just as a side note, it doesn't actually it doesn't do, when a limit is implied, all it's really doing is removing the dial policy from any front ends, including the public front end that are trying to access your share. So once your bandwidth falls back below that threshold, it just reapplies the dial policies, and then your shares just work again. So if you get hit with a limit, you don't need to actually stop anything. You could just wait, and your shares will just start working again. So yeah, there's the resource count section, and then there's the bandwidth section. The rest of the updated, created at, and deleted, those are all just sort of database administravia. Same thing with the ID. And the other thing is now in the limit classes table, there's a backend mode. So we'll get into that in a second, but that's about defining what I'm calling scoped limit classes. So that you can define, if you're using the VPN backend mode, you can have a different set of limits versus the proxy backend mode, or whatever type of share you're doing, you can have different limits. and the limit classes allow you to do three different things, basically. There are unscoped resource count classes. So unscoped meaning there's no backend mode specified. So the way these things are set up to work is you've got the global configuration, and then the unscoped bandwidth classes get applied sort of as a cascade on top of that. So let's say you've got the global configuration you've specified, and we'll get into this one in a second when we actually we'll do some testing. But you specify your global fallback configuration, and then the unscoped resource count and bandwidth classes can override those parts of that setting for a specific user account, and they get applied through a separate table. This table here, the applied limit classes table. And that's basically just an account ID and a limit class ID. So it just applies a limit class to an account. Scope classes, talk about that a little bit. Scope classes work a little bit different. So you've got the unscoped bandwidth and resource count. Those override parts of the global configuration. Scoped classes override the entire configuration for a backend mode. So if you create a scoped class, you kind of have to specify not just the resource count stuff, but also the bandwidth stuff for that backend mode. The docs talk about the limit actions, which is what I said. Basically, it just removes the dial policies from any front ends that are accessing your share. We've always, in 0.4, we supported a flag on the account called limit list that lets you can just a Boolean. If your account is at the limit list, then limits don't apply to your account. There was a race condition in the way that resource count limits were applied in the previous release. There's a new locking mechanism that's Postgres specific that can be enabled if you're self-hosting and you're on Postgres. You can enable locking, and it will eliminate certain race conditions from how the resource count limits are applied. And then I put a caveat section in here. So in this release, one of the limitations of the limit system is that we don't, in the metrics repository. So when you're hosting a zrok instance, there's an influx database that's the metrics repository, the metrics store. And right now we're not tracking bandwidth per backend mode in this release. So any bandwidth limits need to be in aggregate. So like, let's say you've got a global configuration, you want to override it specifically for the web backend mode, and you want to provide an extra, gigabyte per day for the web backend mode. You would need to specify whatever the global amount is plus the 1 gigabyte to sort of aggregate, give the web backend mode all of that. That's the default plus the extra. I expect probably in a release or two to start tracking the backend mode type, and this will change some of the semantics about how the limits system works. And again, the caveat about administration through SQL. If there's anyone out there that is self-hosting this stuff that really, really, really wants like an API to manage some of this stuff, then we probably could do that. But it's for how NetFoundry is hosting and using zrok, it's not necessarily super important. So I didn't put any time into it. It's relatively easy just to create some records in a Postgres database or even SQLite if you're using SQLite. Relatively easy to do that. So yeah, we'll leave it at that for the time being, and we'll see where things take us, and if it's necessary, we can talk about it. And there's a caveat for performance. So when you start defining limit classes, those bandwidth the bandwidth limits have their own periodicity, right? So they've got their own period in minutes, and the global configuration has its own period in minutes, and the scoped scope classes also have their own period in minutes. So if you start creating a bunch of types of limits that all have different periodicities, that ends up turning into a bunch of queries against the metrics store. So it's smart for performance reasons to keep the number of periodicities down. So if you're going to specify your limits in 24-hour blocks or 6-hour blocks or whatever it is, it's probably best to keep all of your limit classes in that same using that same time period. Otherwise, like I said, it just sort of explodes per user. You end up having to evaluate a bunch of different periodicities against the metrics repository. So you got to be careful with that. That's why I put it in here. So let's take a look. I've got my usual development environment set up. I run the zrok. I've got another behind this. I've got my Docker stuff running ZD and running all my zrok, Postgres, and RabbitMQ and all the things I need to do that. But this is sort of my main split where I've got the zrok controller, the zrok metrics bridge, which basically this is how the metrics get into the zrok controller. it tails the metrics from OpenZD and publishes them on an AMQP queue that the zrok controller listens on. And then this is my front end right here. So my public front end, and then this is my UI window. And these are just sort of my two windows I use to do various things while I'm testing. So I just cleaned out and restarted my environment. Let's just give it a quick test. I'm going to use, I've got a scenario already set up. This is not going to work, I think. Yeah, it's not going to work because I'll show you. And again, office hours videos are always unscripted. I'm literally just doing stuff and recording it. So I hope you enjoy that sort of thing. I like to sort of just show you what's going on, and if you like it, you like it. You don't, I guess. So this is my development environment configuration, and I've got it set right now so that there's only, by default, the global configuration is you're only allowed to have one environment and no shares of any kind. And there's a bandwidth limit set with a periodicity of 2 minutes, and you're allowed to transfer, 20K, give or take, right? And I've got my agent cycling every 15 seconds looking to evaluate applied limits. So that means if I do a zrok share public, it's just not going to work because you're not allowed to have any shares right now. So what we'll do, and I've got a set of limit classes here, what we'll do is we'll hit Postgres. Right, there's nothing in my limit classes table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a limit class that's an unscoped resource count class. So I'm going to specify the environments, the shares, reserve shares, and unique names. And I'm going to allow one of each of those. Right, so we'll come in here, we'll insert that, and then I've got my account. What? Did I spell it wrong? It's accounts table. I probably spelled it wrong or did something stupid. Yeah, so I've got my one account here, right? Doesn't matter. You can see my password, wherever. This is a local host thing. None of the credentials in any of this matters. It's just running on my local host. So that's ID 1. And then I've got limit classes. I've got the one we just created, which is ID 1. So then what I'm going to do is do insert into applied limit classes, account ID, limit class ID values 1, 1, right? So now I went ahead and I applied that one limit class. That's this one. That's the resource count class. And now that will let me share, right? So that works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and there's a tool built into the zrok utility. Probably nobody cares about me, that allows you to create traffic and inspect basically sends payloads and inspects that it got back what it expected to get. So it just does it in a loop, and you can configure like the pacing values and the payload sizes randomly and all that sort of stuff. And I use it as a load testing tool, and I use it as a correctness testing tool, that sort of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and it's going to almost immediately hit the limit at 20 kilobytes. Like it may get 1 or 2 requests out, and that's going to be the end of that. So let's just go ahead and run it. And I'm running it in debug so you can see when it's working, and that payload match means it worked, and this is just a bunch of log noise. It's gonna hit the limit here real fast, and we'll maximize the controller. So you can see these share are the usage data flowing into the zrok controller, and then it exceeded the limit. It's 20.5K, and then it went ahead and deleted the service policies for that. So what's going to end up happening is now my looper is going to be throwing mismatches. So you'll see this pattern. I'm going to use this tool a bunch while we look at this stuff. You'll see when it's working, the normal log messages are coming out, and when it's limited, this will happen, right? So it'll start saying mismatch, and then we'll be looking at the controller logs, and you can see this relax function is that the cycle period in the configuration, this cycle right here, how frequently it's doing that. That's what it's doing. It's evaluating applied limits and looking to see, is my usage back below the threshold? And what'll happen is when it falls below it, it'll re-add the dial policies, and this will start working again. So we'll give it a second and watch that happen. It happens so fast. It'll re-enable really quickly also. And then we'll go ahead in a second and add a bandwidth, unscoped bandwidth class to increase my bandwidth. I'm probably not even going to edit out the silence. There's too much stuff that's too fast these days. Sometimes it's just meditative to sit here and stare at a log. So let's stare at the log. I'm recording this on a Thursday. I usually try and record these on Fridays, but just so worked out timing-wise that we're doing it on Thursday. Yep, it's falling back down now, so 29.2. You can see that the time window is sliding to where it's in a second going to re-enable my share. There it goes. So it created the dial policy, and you can see now it's sending traffic again. You can see it in the public front end also. So it was throwing not founds, and now it's sending the traffic. It's going to hit the limit again already. So let's go ahead now and add this other limit class, which is a unscoped bandwidth class, right? So we're going to say every 2 minutes we're going to increase the amount of data, the amount of bandwidth that we can consume in a 2-minute interval by 10 times. So let's go ahead and insert that. Add a new limit class. All right, we've got 2 of them now. The second one is ID2, which is what we'd expect. So let's go ahead and apply that to my account. And because the 20 kilobyte one was already applied, 20.5 kilobyte version, that one's gonna have to relax before it'll pick up the new one. That's just the way that the limits agent works. And we can look at the code in a minute. I'll show you a couple other tricks while we're doing stuff. Yeah, in fact, instead of we only take so much watching the grass grow. So let's go and look at this package controller limits is where most of the limits agent code lives. It's where all the limits agent code live. So basically, the limits agent has a config, and that config looks like this. The number, it's what we looked at in the file. It basically is the struct that's behind that file. It's got an influx reader, which is what it uses to query the metrics database. Some ZD pieces to talk to the ZD stuff. Store is sort of the SQL backend for zrok. The metrics usage data flows in here. It's got a number of actions for warning actions. Those are sort of handlers that the agent, you can put whatever handlers you want. And at some point, maybe we'll provide an extension mechanism that lets you add your own handlers. If you wanted to extend the limits agent, you could. Close and join are sort of for managing that sort of daemon process running in the background. And then this is sort of the main public interface of the agent. It's got this can create environment, can create share, and can access share, right? And these are the resource count checks that run whenever you request to create any of those things. So we'll talk about those in a minute. The bandwidth agent stuff is basically this run method is sort of the daemon, and all it's doing, it's sitting in a loop and it's pulling usage data in off the AMQP queue. And if it's got a share token, which it should, because what the metric side of this stuff does is it looks at the ZD usage data, and then it looks at the ZD usage data, and then it goes ahead and augments it with the zrok details. So it converts like a OpenZD circuit to which share was this and all that sort of stuff. It adds the account ID in the environment, sort of those sorts of things. So if there isn't one, that means that process failed and it shouldn't look at that usage data. And it should be logging. Yeah, it logs that as a warning. So, and if it has a share token, then first thing it's going to do is call enforce. And after it does enforce, it's going to evaluate, is it time to cycle the relax process? So the two sides of the bandwidth stuff is enforcing the limit and relaxing the limit. So let's look at enforce, which is just a little further down here. What it's doing, so it gets a usage, and the usage has the process timestamp, the time interval, the ZD service ID, circuit ID, share token, environment ID, the account ID, and then the transfer amount. So in and out, both directions. So what we're going to do, the first thing we're going to do is load the account ID. And if it can't load that account ID, then something's broken and we return an error. If the account is set to limitless, we don't do anything. We don't bother. And then find share token even if deleted, because find share with token even if deleted. So this is the reason why the deleted flags were added in zrok, because you can create a share, generate a bunch of traffic, delete the share, and then usage data will flow in. So we need to be able to record usage against deleted shares, which is why the shares table has a deleted flag on it. A lot of the other tables have deleted flags now just for consistency with that, but that was why that was added. So find share token even if deleted. So it finds the share. Next thing it does is it gets the user limits, and user limits is a struct called user limits that has the resource count class, the bandwidth class, and the scopes, the scoped classes. That defines the resolved version of, like, these are the limits that actually apply to this account. So what it's doing is it's right here, it's saying what exact limits apply to this account. So that's encapsulating that logic, and that's returned as a user limits instance. Then what it does is it looks to see if any bandwidth limit has been exceeded. So it's saying UL to bandwidth array, which takes these things and collapses them order-wise the way they're supposed to be collapsed into a bandwidth array, and passes that to this any bandwidth limit exceeded, which what that is doing is it's basically querying the metrics repository and looking to see if any of the limits were actually exceeded. And if it does, it returns that limit. Go back to where I was. Returns that limit and calls it exceeded bandwidth class. If it has an error, it returns the error. If it exceeded any class, then we look to see, is that bandwidth class already limited for this account? And if it is, then if it isn't, then we go ahead and limit it. Otherwise, we just basically skip that, saying the limit's already been applied. So what we're doing here, there's a table called bandwidth limit journal, and it's recording the fact that that limit was exceeded for whatever limit class was exceeded. Creates the journal, gets the account, figures out which limit action it was. Was it a warning or was it a limit? If it was a limit, it runs the limit action handle account stuff. So it iterates over that array of limit actions, which was this. I really need to learn this hotkey to go back. I don't know. I need to learn the hotkey to navigate backwards. It only really matters when I'm talking while I'm doing this. That's probably why I never learn it. So it applies, it runs the limit actions, or instead it runs the warning actions. And then after that, it goes ahead and commits the transaction. And that's basically what happens. So every piece of metrics data flows into the limits agent, and then it looks to see what, based, if it has a share token, what account was it, loads whatever limits are necessary for that account, and then looks to see if any of them have been exceeded. If any of them have been exceeded and haven't been limited yet, or the actions haven't run, then it runs them, is basically what it's doing. And then the relax portion of it, so let's look at that. The relax portion of it's a little more complicated. What that's doing, starts a transaction, and basically find all bandwidth limit journal. So it looks at the entirety of all of the limits that have been applied in the bandwidth limit journal, and then it iterates over them. It keeps a local cache to minimize the number of account lookups, the number of metrics repository hits for each account, and all that sort of stuff. It iterates over them. If it doesn't have those pieces of information, it goes ahead and loads the cache. So the rest of the code can just assume that the cache has already been loaded. And then basically gets the limit class, loads whatever limit class was specified in the bandwidth limit journal, and then looks to see if it's still over the transfer bytes exceeded. If it's no longer over the transfer bytes exceeded and it was a limit action, it goes ahead and runs the code to relax. It runs the relax actions using this for loop, and then basically deletes it from the limit journal. So that's pretty much that's all it does. It's pretty straightforward. Some of these are, we looked at a couple of these, are basically helper functions. So let's go back and see what's going on here now. So if we go, let's log into the front end while we're at it, right? So if I come over here and I say localhost, right, and I log in, you can see that my activity, it keeps having periodicity to when it's limited and not limited. So we're currently transferring data. And let's show another example here. So I've got another, yeah, so you just hit the limit. And right now, the web console for this release, it's going to just put limit indicators on everything if you have any limit applied at all. This UI is going to get some love at some point fairly soon, and when it does, I'll figure out a way to build a better way to indicate limits. I really kind of want some sort of way to communicate with users that's a little bit better than email. I don't know. If you've got ideas about that, feel free to reach out. But I think, you know, some sort of in-app notification, something like that. We're going to have to build something like that at some point soon. So that's on the roadmap. But what we'll do is this share type that we're running now is a proxy share, right? So it's backend mode is proxy. What we'll do is create a scoped class to give the web share type more capacity, right? So I've got a limit class here specifying the backend mode shares all the resource count stuff and then all of the bandwidth stuff. And I'm going to say for the web backend mode, I want more shares, and I want a much bigger transfer limit, right? So we'll take this and create it. So let's just apply that. And then I'm sure that's ID 3, but let's just double check it, because why not? Insert into applied count ID limit class ID values 1, 3, right? So now I've applied a new limit class. So when this goes, so what I'm going to go ahead and do now is let's just get out of this Postgres, and then I'm going to say zrok share public backend mode web headless, and we'll give it this folder that I'm in, right? So, oh yeah, it's not that. So in fact, you can see that the regular, if I don't use any other share type right now, like if I try and just do this, I can't. But if I use the backend mode web, I can, because web has a different limit than everything else right now for my account. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and open this in a browser so we can look at this. This is here. And then when we get into a limited state, so now we're in a limited state, and this is going to start throwing errors saying that it can't send any data. But this share still works because it's a web share. So that's basically the reason for these limit classes, is you can specify, you can upgrade individual accounts to have much bigger limits or even potentially smaller limits, depending on, you know, what they're doing and what your use cases are. And then you can also specify different limits for different backend mode types. And I expect that these capabilities will probably grow quite a bit as we I mean, I don't know if they'll grow quite a bit, but they'll probably, I'm sure there'll be things that we need to add to handle various things that we need to do. So yeah, that's more or less the way it works. And let's take a quick look at, let's see, can create environment. So pretty straightforward. This limit check lock is, if config enforcing, limit check lock is that when you go into the store and you say enable locking, it's the thing that invokes that, and it's basically doing a pessimistic upsert on a table, on a limit check lock table, is to ensure that only for any given account only one limit check can be in process at any given point in time. So that's all it's doing. What it does is it gets that user limits. So we're trying to see, is this user allowed to create an environment right now? So what ends up happening is get the user limits, looks at the resource count limits. If the number of environments is greater than store unlimited, so this is saying if the user's effective limit says that they've got a limit that's greater than unlimited, because unlimited is -1, means they have a limit on the number of environments. We find the environments in our account and we add one to it. Is that if that's bigger than the configured amount, then it fails. It's really that simple. So you can create it, and that's a little bit different than it was for the previous release, because previously, if the user had any limit effective, like if they've had a bandwidth limit applied, you couldn't create environments or anything. So this is a little bit different now. Can create shares a little bit more complicated. Same sort of pattern. If it's enforcing, like if the instance is actually enforcing limits, run the limit check lock, get the user limits, looks at all the scopes. First thing it does is it looks to see if for the backend mode of the share you're creating, is there a scoped bandwidth class for it? Because it's going to look and see if there's a bandwidth class for it in the journal. Yeah, is bandwidth class limited for account? It's basically saying, is that bandwidth class limited or not for the account? If it is, then you can't create a share. Otherwise, it's looking for, oh yeah, so if there isn't a scoped backend mode, it's then saying like, well, let's just look at the global, the actual bandwidth scope that's in effect, and if that's limited, then you can't create a share. So then what it does is it does the same thing that the environments does, where it's basically finding it's counting the things, and it's looking to see, is that, if you add one, is that going to exceed the limit? So it's saying if the number resource RC is, yeah, the resource count shares, if the number of shares is bigger than a limited, basically if any of these things are specified, run this code, find the environment to the account, and then it basically is tallying these things up by having to look at all the shares for the environment. At some point, I probably can write a join or something to do this in one operation, but database performance hasn't really been a super big issue for any of this stuff so far. So I'm happier to keep it a little simpler right now. But find all the shares for environment, count them, and then basically if the number of shares, reserved shares, or unique names is bigger than their limit, then it won't work. Is basically what it comes down to. And oh, I don't need that. That's from debugging. I don't need to do that log spam anymore. Right? Yeah, that's just debugging. There's no utility in that. And can't access share is the same thing, but when the user, whatever account's trying to access the share, it's looking at the sharer's limits to see if they are allowed to do that or not. Same sort of idea. So that's basically it. This should continue to run. Interestingly, that limit is fairly low on the, yeah, this is limited. This is still running. So I could probably exceed this limit pretty easily by just requesting this a bunch. All right, and we'll see, have a couple of limits in effect. I'm sure that's enough to do it. Let's just watch this. Yeah, so it went ahead and exceeded limit class 3 backend mode web, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, 4.6 megabytes. So now this share is no longer going to work. And if we just wait until the limit expires, and we'll probably do that, I'll find something to talk about until this expires. It's not more than 2 minutes. So, but you'll see once that limit relaxes, I can hit reload and the share will start working again. And it's, like I said, it's literally doing that with dial policies. So, but that would mean for sure that this guy is going to stay limited because this is a much lower bandwidth limit than the web share does. And again, those shares are aggregate, regardless of bandwidth, regardless of backend mode, those shares are aggregate. So you will, those limits will be applied. There's one bandwidth number. So yeah, okay. See, and of course metrics will, all this stuff's gonna continue to work. All that stuff works great. Still waiting for somebody to approve my PR. We like to look at each other's PRs. It's good for code hygiene. I'm the primary developer that works on the zrok stuff. Like, it's not usually, there'll be people that will make guest appearances at various points in times. But generally most of it falls on me. So a lot of the time, you know, I don't know how much utility there is in other people looking at the code, but it's a smart thing to do. So we try and do that. It's like this limit's still in force, and it started at 2293 and we're at 2383. So we need 120 seconds basically for 2 minutes. So it probably, yep, created dial service policy. So that means that the web share came back, but I bet this one's, oh yeah, because it's 2 minute windows. They both went away. It makes sense. Yeah, I thought I was wrong there for a second. It's not. Yeah, okay. So yeah, that's basically the limit stuff. And it's surprisingly, there's a lot of testing. There's a lot of little fiddly details that had to be worked out to make this stuff work. Anyone that's familiar with kind of what we're doing with the zrok IO instance, there's the new My zrok portal, which is sort of how you pay for things and sign up for bigger subscriptions and that sort of stuff. a lot of these limit classes are going to be implemented when you purchase subscriptions there. It'll enable additional limits for your account and allow you to do things that you couldn't otherwise do. So that's what this is here for. Coming up, like I haven't done any of these office hours videos for a while. I definitely want to get back to doing them. I enjoy doing this. I don't know if there's one person out there listening to me. Whatever, it's fun. I appreciate you. If you're the one person, like, thank you for listening. That's awesome. Feel free to reach out. Like if there's something you want to see, or you can always email. You can always hit our discourse and talk about, bring stuff up there. There's a zrok category there. Feel free to bring stuff up for office hours or whatever. I think next week I've been talking about, I think I talked about it on Reddit or something a while back, but there's going to be a series called Building Zrok, and it's going to basically dovetail with a paper that I wrote called ZD Native Applications, and it's all about how to build native applications on top of OpenZD and why that's a huge differentiator and what that brings to the table. And I think it's subtle but a hugely important difference. And I'm going to talk about building ZD applications in general, but I'm specifically probably going to end up building a toy version of something like zrok, just to sort of walk through like how you build this stuff on top of OpenZD, because it's you think about things a little bit differently. Like all your traditional sort of network programming stuff is useful, but some of the capabilities that you've got available to you are different, and those capabilities enable you to do some pretty powerful stuff. So I'd like to knock out the building zrok stuff. I'll probably get out at like a 4.32 or 33 pretty quickly after that. I'm sure there'll be some features and little tweaks that need to be made to some of this stuff. I'm going to go through the board and try and get through a few more of these things. Like I kind of want to try and hit, I need to add the resource count limit for front ends. I would like to try and hit the limit indicators in the console, at least do something maybe a little bit better than that. I don't know what I can do. I'll see what I can pull off. We're going to start the hosted zrok stuff is going to have a ability to pay to bring your own domain. So we're going to end up doing that through the public front end mechanism, which means I need to add some permissions for people to have their own private public front ends. So that'll make more sense when we kind of get it all set up. But I need to add a permission model for that, which will be useful for the self-hosters that kind of want to, control who can access which front ends and that sort of stuff. Kind of want to revisit some of the CLI stuff, maybe add some better share details now that we've got the access grants and the closed permission mode and some of that sort of stuff. A lot of the rest of this is sort of may or may not be done before I start on 0.5. This is the 0.4 board. Remove my account. I'd like to add something to allow people to sort of opt out of being communicated with if they really don't want that, or even delete their account entirely if they want that. We got a couple of requests for FreeBSD, so I played around with that a little bit. There's some new stuff with the VPN backend mode that needs a little bit of attention to kind of get working on FreeBSD. I don't think that's a big deal, but we'll try and get to that also. And then 0.5 is the whole, basically I see 0.5 as being about zrok daemon, declarative sharing, a bunch of really UI, being able to enroll the daemon in the control plane and having a single pane of glass to manage your entire zrok fleet, like all kinds of cool stuff like that. Will all be opt-in. Like you're still gonna be able to use zrok just like you do today. Like just zrok share public, bang, just works. Like that's gonna be there. But if you've got bigger, more complicated environments and you want to do more stuff, we're gonna have a bunch of cool tools that make that really, really slick. We've had a couple of requests for like HTTP debugging tools and stuff. Try and slide some of that stuff into 0.5. Desktop UI. There's a bunch of cool stuff in here. That's the local debugging interface. Is sort of the HTTP. Getting to a point where the limited shares don't return 404s, they return 429s. Like there's a little bit of a technical concern for that. Like we're gonna have to change the share configuration in ZD to do that a little bit. So that's kind of what's going on. So yeah, thank you so much for paying attention and for being here, and thanks for caring about zrok. Like just so you know, there are real people who work on this primarily. There's real people at NetFoundry. We got a great little team. but there's real people that work on this stuff. And I know I personally, I'm not going to sit around and beg for stars and stuff, but stars mean a lot. Like when you go to the GitHub repository and you throw a star on there, it's always nice to know that somebody is watching and cares enough to do that. As the paid offerings get better, I mean, it's always helpful if there's something that you think is worth paying for. I know I personally would appreciate that, because all of that interest is what helps zrok to continue being funded by NetFoundry. So yeah, thank you so much. Hope everything's going well in your world, and I'll see you in the next one of these. Thanks. Bye.